The arrest that changed everything. The late autumn air was crisp, carrying with it a faint scent of fallen leaves and the quiet hum of city life winding down. Dr. Elise Monroe, a renowned neurosurgeon, had just completed an exhausting double shift at Memorial Hospital. Her days often blurred into nights, but tonight she felt an unusual sense of calm as she stopped by the local supermarket. Dressed in her casual workout clothes and a hoodie, Elise looked like any ordinary woman. What no one could see was the weight of her day, the life-saving surgeries, the stern conversations with worried families, and the constant pressure of perfection that her job demanded. She moved through the aisles, her mind still on her last patient, a young boy whose life had hung by a thread. Grabbing a basket, she loaded a few essentials: milk, bread, and some fresh fruit, before heading to the self-checkout line. The store was sparsely populated, its fluorescent lights casting a cool glow over the shelves. Lost in thought, Elise barely noticed the police cruiser parked at the far end of the lot as she exited the store. Inside the cruiser, Officer Margaret Keene, a 12-year veteran of the force, was finishing her paperwork for the day. Known for her sharp instincts and no-nonsense attitude, Margaret prided herself on her dedication to keeping the community safe. She glanced up from her clipboard and noticed Elise walking briskly toward her car, her basket of groceries in hand. Something about the scene didn't sit right with her. A woman alone, dressed in casual attire, in a dimly lit parking lot. It triggered an all-too-familiar suspicion. Margaret's mind immediately went to the recent uptick in car break-ins and petty thefts in the area. Could be nothing, she muttered, but her instincts pushed her to investigate. Leaving her coffee on the dashboard, she stepped out of the cruiser, adjusting her utility belt as she approached Elise. "Excuse me, ma'am," Margaret called out firmly, her voice slicing through the still night. Elise froze mid-step, startled by the sudden interruption. She turned slowly to see the officer walking toward her, her hand hovering near her holstered weapon. "Yes, officer," Elise replied, her tone polite but cautious. "Is there a problem?" Margaret's eyes scanned Elise, taking in her casual attire and the items in her hands. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Elise blinked, confused by the question. "I'm heading to my car. I just finished shopping," she said, lifting the small bag of groceries as evidence. Margaret wasn't convinced. "Do you have an ID on you?" she demanded, her tone sharp and unyielding. Elise hesitated, her pulse quickening. "May I ask why you're stopping me?" "I haven't done anything wrong." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I'll decide that," she said curtly. "ID, please." Elise sighed, her years of navigating high-pressure situations helping her maintain her composure. She reached into her pocket and retrieved her wallet, handing over her driver's license. Margaret inspected it closely, her expression unreadable. "Dr. Elise Monroe," Margaret read aloud, her tone skeptical. "You're a doctor?" "Yes, I'm a neurosurgeon at Memorial," Elise replied evenly, though her irritation was beginning to seep through. Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she pocketed the ID and motioned toward her cruiser. "You'll have to come with me, ma'am. We need to clear this up at the station." Elise's eyes widened in disbelief. "Clear what up? I've done nothing wrong." Margaret's expression remained stoic. "Your behavior seems suspicious. Let's go." As the cold metal of handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Elise felt a surge of indignation. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered, their murmurs of curiosity and concern creating an unsettling background noise. Elise tried to steady her breathing, knowing that any display of anger could be misconstrued. The ride to the station was a tense one. Elise sat in silence, her mind racing with thoughts of disbelief and frustration. She thought of the countless hours she had dedicated to her community, the lives she had saved, and the sacrifices she had made. All of it seemed irrelevant in this moment. At the station, Lieutenant James Hartley was informed of the arrest. A seasoned officer known for his fairness, Hartley immediately recognized Elise's name. Dr. Monroe, the neurosurgeon?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Yes, sir," Margaret replied, her tone defensive. She was acting suspiciously in the parking lot. Hartley shook his head, his frustration evident. "Bring her to my office now." Elise was led into Hartley's office, her posture poised despite the indignity of her situation. Hartley offered a polite nod as she entered. "Dr. Monroe, I'm Lieutenant Hartley. Let me start by apologizing for any inconvenience." Elise met his gaze, her voice steady but firm. "An inconvenience. I was handcuffed and brought here without cause." Hartley turned to Margaret, his tone sharp. "Officer Keene, on what grounds did you make this arrest?" Margaret hesitated, her confidence wavering under Hartley's scrutiny. She seemed out of place. "I thought she might be up to something." "Out of place," Hartley echoed, his voice rising. "Dr. Monroe is one of the most respected professionals in this community. Did you verify her ID?" "Yes, but," Margaret began, but Hartley cut her off. "No buts. This was a baseless arrest, and it reflects poorly on our department." Turning back to Elise, Hartley said, "Dr. Monroe, I deeply regret this incident. You have my sincerest apologies. Officer Keene's actions will be thoroughly reviewed." Elise nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I appreciate your apology, but this situation highlights a much larger issue, one that needs addressing." Hartley nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, and I'll ensure this matter is taken seriously." As Elise left the station, she paused to address the group of officers gathered near the entrance. Justice isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about treating everyone with dignity and respect. We must all strive to do better. Her words hung in the air, a poignant reminder of the responsibility each person carried. For Margaret, the weight of her actions began to sink in. She realized that her snap judgment had not only humiliated an innocent woman, but also undermined the trust her community placed in her. And so, the story began, a tale of injustice that would ripple through the community, challenging assumptions and inspiring change in unexpected ways. Unveiling assumptions and ripples of consequence. The events of the night were far from over. Dr. Elise Monroe's arrest wasn't just a mistake. It was a spark that lit a firestorm of conversation in the city. By the time Elise returned to her modest suburban home, her name had already begun circulating online. A bystander at the parking lot had recorded the encounter and shared it on social media. Within hours, the video had gone viral, accompanied by hashtags like #JusticeForDrMonroe and #EndVSNow. Elise sat at her kitchen table, staring at her untouched cup of tea. The exhaustion of her day at the hospital paled in comparison to the emotional turmoil she now faced. As a neurosurgeon, she was accustomed to high-stakes situations, but this was different. This was personal. Her fingers hovered over her phone as messages poured in from colleagues, friends, and even strangers. Some offered words of support, while others demanded to know what had happened. Her assistant at the hospital, Maria, called late in the evening. "Dr. Monroe, are you okay? I saw the video. This is outrageous." Elise sighed, her voice weary. "I'm fine, Maria. It's been a long day. I'll address it when I'm ready." Maria hesitated. "People are talking, Elise. You're trending. Maybe it's time to use this platform. People are listening." Elise thanked her and ended the call. She leaned back in her chair, considering Maria's words. It wasn't just about her now. The incident had struck a chord because it mirrored countless other stories. Stories that didn't always have a platform. Elise had spent her life advocating for change in healthcare, but perhaps it was time to extend that advocacy to issues like systemic bias and accountability. Meanwhile, at the police precinct, the fallout had begun. Officer Margaret Keene sat in the break room, her head in her hands. The once confident officer now felt the full weight of her actions. The department had launched an internal review, and Margaret knew her career hung by a thread. Lieutenant Hartley had called for an emergency meeting the following morning. His voice had been firm, with no room for argument. We'll discuss the handling of last night's arrest and review our protocols. Be prepared." The precinct buzzed with tension. Officers whispered in the hallways, their words carrying both judgment and apprehension. Some defended Margaret, chalking her actions up to a bad call. Others were less forgiving, citing the importance of discernment and the damage caused by her assumptions. Margaret sat alone, replaying the night in her mind. Her justifications felt hollow now. The truth was undeniable. She had judged Elise based on appearance and circumstance rather than evidence. The realization stung more deeply than any reprimand. The next morning, the precinct conference room was filled to capacity. Officers sat shoulder to shoulder, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Lieutenant Hartley stood at the front, a stack of papers in hand. His tone was measured but firm. Last night's incident was not just a lapse in judgment, he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. It was a failure of our department to uphold the principles we are sworn to protect: justice, fairness, and respect. He turned to Margaret, who sat stiffly in her chair. "Officer Keene, would you care to explain your actions?" Margaret hesitated, her face flushed. I thought she was acting suspiciously," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to escalate." Hartley's expression remained neutral. "Your intentions are irrelevant. The consequences of your actions have reverberated throughout this community. Dr. Monroe's arrest was unjustified, and the public demands accountability." He addressed the room as a whole. "We are not just enforcers of the law. We are stewards of trust. Every decision we make, every interaction we have, shapes how the public perceives us. Last night, we failed." The meeting ended with a somber silence. Hartley announced mandatory training sessions on implicit bias and community engagement, a step he hoped would rebuild trust. Margaret left the room, her career uncertain, but the lessons she had learned were seared into her conscience. Across town, Elise received an unexpected visitor, her longtime mentor, Dr. Samuel Gray. A retired surgeon and activist, Dr. Gray had always been a source of wisdom for Elise. He arrived unannounced, his weathered face betraying a mix of concern and pride. "I heard about what happened," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "How are you holding up?" Elise offered a weak smile. "I'm managing." "It's been overwhelming." Dr. Gray nodded. "It's not just about you anymore, Elise. This incident has given people a reason to talk, to question, to demand better. You have a unique opportunity here." Elise frowned. "I never asked for this. I just wanted to buy groceries." "I know," Dr. Gray said gently. "But sometimes, the fight chooses us. You've always been a voice for change in medicine. Why not extend that voice to something even bigger?" The words lingered long after Dr. Gray left. Elise began to realize that her story could serve as a catalyst for broader conversations about bias, prejudice, and justice. She decided to act. By the end of the week, Elise had penned an open letter addressing the incident. In it, she detailed her experience, emphasizing the importance of accountability and systemic reform. The letter wasn't angry or accusatory. It was measured, thoughtful, and deeply personal. She ended with a call to action. "This is not just about my experience. It's about creating a society where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Let this be a turning point, not just for me, but for all of us." The letter was published in the city's leading newspaper and shared widely online. Elise was inundated with messages, some supportive, some critical, but the overwhelming majority were positive. Her words had struck a chord, and the conversation they sparked began to grow. At the precinct, the mood shifted. Officers began attending the mandated training sessions, which included discussions led by community leaders. One session featured a surprise guest, Dr. Elise Monroe herself. Margaret sat in the back of the room, her heart pounding as Elise took the stage. She spoke candidly about her experience, not to vilify but to educate. Her words were powerful, weaving together stories of her work in medicine with her reflections on the night of her arrest. "I believe in second chances," Elise said, her gaze sweeping the room. I believe we can all do better if we're willing to confront our biases and listen to one another." Margaret's eyes stung with unshed tears. Elise's grace and strength humbled her, and for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. The path to redemption wouldn't be easy, but Margaret was willing to walk it. The ripples of that night's events continued to spread, transforming not just the lives of Elise and Margaret, but also the city itself. Policies were revisited, conversations were sparked, and bridges were built. The journey was far from over, but it had begun, and that was enough. The ripple effect. The air buzzed with an electric intensity as Elise Monroe's story became the city's focal point. The viral video of her arrest, coupled with her heartfelt open letter, had transformed the incident into a lightning rod for discussions about justice, accountability, and implicit bias. The city, which had often prided itself on its progressive values, was now forced to confront uncomfortable truths about its institutions and the people who served them. For Elise, life had become a whirlwind of public appearances, interviews, and community meetings. Each time she spoke, her message was clear. The need for systemic change transcended her personal experience. Still, she wrestled with the dual weight of her professional responsibilities and her newfound role as an advocate. At times, the burden felt overwhelming, but she couldn't shake the sense of responsibility to use her voice for those who couldn't. One evening, Elise attended a town hall meeting organized by a coalition of community leaders and activists. The auditorium was packed with people from all walks of life: students, retirees, professionals, and activists, all eager to voice their thoughts. The meeting's theme, Bridging the Divide, underscored the growing urgency to address not only police accountability, but also the deeper societal issues fueling such incidents. Elise was invited as a guest speaker, and when her name was announced, the room erupted into applause. Dressed in a simple blazer and slacks, Elise approached the podium, her calm demeanor masking the nervous energy bubbling beneath the surface. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady. "I want to start by saying thank you for your support, your courage, and your willingness to be part of this conversation. What happened to me was an injustice, but it was not unique. It's a reflection of biases and systems that have gone unexamined for far too long." Her words resonated deeply. She spoke not just about her arrest, but also about the broader implications of unchecked power and prejudice. "We cannot afford to focus solely on individual accountability," she said. "True change requires us to examine the systems that perpetuate inequality. It's not just about one officer's actions. It's about the culture that allowed those actions to occur." As Elise finished, the room gave her a standing ovation. She stepped down from the podium, her heart racing. In the crowd, she noticed Margaret Keene, sitting quietly near the back. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Elise gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Margaret, still grappling with the consequences of her actions, looked away, her emotions a mix of shame and gratitude. Margaret's suspension had given her ample time for reflection. The training sessions mandated by the precinct were challenging but necessary. They forced her to confront her own biases and question the assumptions she had carried throughout her career. One particular session stood out, a workshop led by a team of psychologists and sociologists who delved into the science of implicit bias. The facilitator, Dr. Nadia Kumar, was direct but compassionate. "Biases aren't inherently evil," she explained. "They're shortcuts our brains use to process information. The problem arises when we act on those biases without questioning them. That's when they become dangerous." Margaret found herself nodding along, her mind drifting back to the night of Elise's arrest. She had assumed Elise didn't belong in that parking lot, that her casual attire and hurried demeanor signaled something suspicious. Those assumptions had led to a series of decisions that now haunted her. "Bias is like a muscle," Dr. Kumar continued. "It can be unlearned, but it requires effort, awareness, and practice. The first step is acknowledging it." Margaret left the session feeling both empowered and burdened. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that she could change, not just for herself, but for the community she had sworn to serve. While Margaret worked to rebuild herself, the city saw a surge in grassroots initiatives aimed at fostering dialogue and understanding. One such initiative was Coffee and Conversations, a program that brought officers and community members together in informal settings to discuss their experiences and concerns. Elise was invited to the inaugural event, and despite her reservations, she agreed to attend. The event was held at a local cafe, its cozy interior filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Small groups formed at tables, and the conversations were candid, sometimes uncomfortable, but always constructive. Elise found herself seated with a diverse group, including 2 young activists, an older man who had lived in the city for decades, and an off-duty officer named Ryan. Ryan, a soft-spoken man with a kind demeanor, was one of the first to address Elise. "I want to say I'm sorry for what you went through," he said, his voice earnest. "I know it doesn't change what happened, but I hope you know that many of us are trying to do better." Elise appreciated his words but didn't let the moment pass without a challenge. "Trying isn't enough, Ryan," she said gently. "Intentions are important, but they don't erase the harm caused by actions or inaction. We need accountability, not just good intentions." The group nodded in agreement, and the conversation continued, touching on topics like community policing, systemic racism, and the power of storytelling. By the end of the evening, Elise felt a sense of cautious optimism. Change was slow, but it was possible. Amidst all this, Elise's personal life began to show signs of strain. Her demanding schedule left little time for rest or connection. Her best friend, Naomi, staged an intervention one evening, showing up at Elise's door with takeout and a firm look. "You're burning out," Naomi said bluntly, setting the food on the table. "You can't save the world if you're running on empty." Elise sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I don't have a choice, Naomi. People are counting on me." "They're counting on you to lead, not to self-destruct," Naomi replied. "You've always been a fighter, Elise, but even fighters need time to recharge." The words hit home. Elise realized she needed to find balance, to prioritize self-care without losing sight of the bigger picture. That night, she allowed herself to rest, knowing the fight for justice would still be there in the morning. The city began to change in small but meaningful ways. Policies were revised, community programs expanded, and dialogues deepened. Elise continued to be a central figure in the movement, but she was no longer alone. The ripples of her experience had spread, touching countless lives and inspiring a collective push for progress. As the weeks turned into months, the story of Elise's arrest became a symbol, not of despair, but of possibility. It reminded everyone that even in moments of injustice, there was an opportunity for growth, connection, and transformation. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like the city was moving in the right direction. The turning tide. The cold winds of winter began sweeping through the city as Dr. Elise Monroe's story continued to reverberate. What had started as a moment of personal injustice had grown into a larger movement for change, one that revealed the fractures in the city's systems while illuminating paths toward healing. Elise's journey, however, was far from over, and the challenges ahead tested not just her resolve, but the collective will of a community on the brink of transformation. The city council chambers were packed to capacity. Rows of chairs stretched to the back of the room, with standing crowds pressing against the walls. The council had convened an emergency session to address the growing demands for police reform, and Elise had been invited to testify. Her presence alone carried weight, a symbol of both the harm caused and the potential for change. Seated at the front, Elise waited for her turn to speak, her hands resting on a carefully prepared statement. The atmosphere was tense. Council members exchanged whispered conversations, while protesters and supporters alike filled the room with a low hum of anticipation. Finally, her name was called. As she stood and walked to the microphone, the room fell silent. Elise took a deep breath, scanning the crowd. "Good evening, members of the council," she began, her voice steady but firm. "I am here not as a victim, but as a citizen who believes in the power of accountability and the potential for progress." She recounted the night of her arrest in vivid detail, emphasizing not the humiliation she endured, but the systemic flaws it revealed. "This is not about one officer or one incident," she said, her gaze steady. "It is about a culture that allows assumptions and biases to dictate actions. It is about a system that fails to hold itself accountable." Her testimony was met with applause from the audience, but she didn't stop there. Elise presented a series of recommendations, developed in collaboration with community leaders, activists, and legal experts. These included mandatory de-escalation training, greater transparency in police misconduct investigations, and the establishment of an independent oversight board. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Council members exchanged glances, clearly moved. One of them, an older man named Richard Calloway, leaned into his microphone. "Dr. Monroe," he said, "your words carry immense weight. I assure you, this council will not let them go unheard." Meanwhile, Officer Margaret Keene's journey took her down a parallel but equally challenging path. Since her suspension, she had committed herself to understanding the biases that had led her to that fateful decision. But understanding wasn't enough. Margaret felt an overwhelming need to make amends, not just to Elise but to the community she had wronged. One morning, Margaret visited a local community center known for its outreach programs. The director, a formidable woman named Carla Rodriguez, greeted her with a skeptical glance. "Officer Keene," Carla said, folding her arms, "I assume you're not here for PR." Margaret nodded. "No, ma'am. I'm here to learn, and to help, if you'll let me." Carla studied her for a long moment before nodding. "We'll see if you're serious." Over the weeks that followed, Margaret became a regular presence at the center. She worked with at-risk youth, attended community forums, and even participated in a workshop on restorative justice. The process was humbling. Each conversation, each story, chipped away at the defenses she had built over years of policing. For the first time, Margaret began to see her badge not as a shield, but as a responsibility. The city itself was changing, albeit slowly. Elise's advocacy, combined with mounting public pressure, had spurred the council into action. New policies were enacted, including body camera mandates and community policing initiatives. Training programs focused on implicit bias and cultural competency became mandatory. Yet, the changes were not without resistance. Some officers viewed the reforms as an attack on their integrity, while others resented the scrutiny. Tensions flared within the department, culminating in heated debates during roll calls and training sessions. Lieutenant James Hartley found himself at the center of it all, tasked with navigating the delicate balance between reform and morale. "Change is hard," Hartley told his officers during a precinct meeting. "But it's necessary. If we want to rebuild trust, we have to start by holding ourselves accountable." Amidst the broader changes, Elise and Margaret found themselves on an unexpected collision course. The opportunity came during a panel discussion on restorative justice, organized by the city's Human Rights Commission. Both women were invited to speak, though neither knew the other would be there. The event was held in a spacious auditorium, its stage framed by banners bearing the words "Justice through Understanding." Elise arrived early, taking a seat near the front. When she saw Margaret walk in, her heart skipped a beat. The sight of the officer who had arrested her stirred a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a strange sense of curiosity. Margaret spotted Elise almost immediately. She hesitated, her instincts urging her to retreat, but something stronger kept her rooted. Gathering her courage, she approached Elise, her hands trembling slightly. "Dr. Monroe," Margaret began, her voice soft. I didn't know you'd be here." Elise looked up, her expression unreadable. "Neither did I," she said after a pause. Margaret swallowed hard. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said, her voice cracking. "But I need you to know, I'm trying to be better. Elise studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Trying is a start," she said, "but it's not the end." The panel discussion that followed was one of the most powerful events either of them had ever attended. Elise spoke eloquently about the need for systemic change, while Margaret shared her own journey of reckoning and accountability. Their words, though different, converged on a common theme: the need for empathy, understanding, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. When the event ended, the two women found themselves standing together outside the auditorium. The air was cold, their breaths visible in the dim light of the street lamps. "I meant what I said," Margaret said quietly. "I'm not done trying." Elise offered a faint smile. "Neither am I." The ripple effects of that night continued to spread, touching lives in ways neither Elise nor Margaret could have anticipated. Their shared story became a symbol of possibility, a reminder that even the deepest divides could be bridged with effort, humility, and grace. For Elise, the journey was about more than justice. It was about creating a legacy of change. For Margaret, it was about redemption and the realization that true strength lay in acknowledging one's flaws and working to overcome them. As winter gave way to spring, the city stood on the cusp of transformation. The work was far from over, but the seeds of progress had been planted. And for Elise and Margaret, the path ahead, though uncertain, was one they were determined to walk, together if necessary. Building bridges, breaking barriers. The city was awakening to the first signs of spring, a season that seemed to mirror the cautious hope taking root in its streets. As cherry blossoms began to bloom along avenues and parks, so too did the initiatives aimed at healing the deep rifts within the community. At the heart of it all were two women who had become unlikely symbols of change: Dr. Elise Monroe, whose arrest sparked a movement, and Officer Margaret Keene, whose actions became a turning point in her own journey toward redemption. Elise sat in her home office, surrounded by stacks of papers, reports, and correspondence. Since the viral video and her testimony before the city council, her life had been a whirlwind of advocacy work. She had taken a temporary leave from the hospital to focus on the reform efforts that had grown far beyond her initial involvement. It was exhausting, but Elise felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced before. That morning, an email from the city's Department of Community Engagement caught her attention. It was an invitation to participate in a newly launched program called Bridging Voices, a series of moderated discussions between law enforcement and community members. The program was designed to foster understanding and collaboration, and Elise had been asked to co-lead the inaugural session alongside an officer. The officer assigned to her, Margaret Keene. Elise stared at the screen, her mind racing. She had shared a stage with Margaret during a restorative justice panel weeks earlier, and while it had been a powerful moment, she hadn't expected to cross paths with her again so soon. Her first instinct was to decline, but something held her back. After a moment's hesitation, she typed a simple response: "I'll do it." The first Bridging Voices session was held in a community center on the city's west side. The room was arranged in a circle to encourage open dialogue, with a diverse group of participants that included activists, local business owners, students, and officers from various precincts. At the center of it all were Elise and Margaret, seated side by side. Margaret arrived early, her nerves evident in the way she fiddled with her notebook. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing how much it meant, not just to the community but to her own journey. When Elise walked in, Margaret stood and offered a tentative smile. "Dr. Monroe," she said, extending a hand, "thank you for agreeing to do this." Elise shook her hand, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Let's see how it goes." The session began with introductions, followed by a sharing exercise. Each participant was asked to recount a personal experience that had shaped their perspective on policing or community relations. The stories were raw and unfiltered, ranging from tales of mistrust and pain to moments of unexpected kindness and connection. Elise shared her experience of the arrest, not to assign blame, but to highlight the ripple effects of such incidents. "What happened to me was humiliating," she said, her voice steady. but it also revealed the broader issues that we all need to confront, issues of bias, power, and accountability. When it was Margaret's turn, she hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I spent a lot of time reflecting on my actions that night," she began. "I made assumptions that led to a decision I deeply regret. I've learned that an apology isn't enough. It's about what you do next. And that's why I'm here." The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy. For the first time, Margaret felt a sliver of something she hadn't expected: acceptance. As the weeks passed, bridging voices gained momentum. The sessions grew larger, attracting media attention and support from local organizations. Elise and Margaret became the faces of the program, their partnership a testament to the power of accountability and reconciliation. While their relationship remained professional, a mutual respect began to form, rooted in their shared commitment to change. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Margaret approached Elise as they were packing up. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice hesitant. Elise nodded. "Of course." "Why did you agree to work with me?" Margaret asked. "After everything, I wouldn't have blamed you if you'd refused." Elise paused, considering her response. "Because change doesn't happen in isolation," she said finally. "If we're going to fix this system, we need to work together, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable." Margaret nodded, her throat tightening. "Thank you. That means more than I can say." While bridging voices flourished, the city's broader reform efforts faced significant challenges. Resistance from within the police department was particularly strong. Some officers viewed the reforms as unnecessary and punitive, arguing that they undermined their authority. Protests from police unions made headlines, with calls to roll back certain measures gaining traction in some quarters. Lieutenant James Hartley found himself at the center of the storm. As one of the department's most respected leaders, he was tasked with implementing the new policies while managing the growing divide within the force. It was a thankless job, but Hartley refused to back down. During a precinct-wide meeting, he addressed the concerns head-on. "Change is hard," he told his officers, "but it's also necessary. We can't rebuild trust with our community if we're not willing to hold ourselves accountable. If you're here to serve, truly serve, then these reforms shouldn't scare you. They should inspire you." Not everyone was convinced, but Hartley's words planted seeds of doubt among the dissenters. Slowly, attitudes began to shift. Amidst these challenges, Elise's advocacy efforts extended beyond the city. She was invited to speak at national conferences, her voice becoming a powerful tool for change. While the attention was gratifying, it also came at a cost. The relentless schedule took a toll on her health and personal life. Her best friend, Naomi, staged another intervention. "Elise, you can't pour from an empty cup," she said one evening, handing Elise a mug of herbal tea. "You need to take care of yourself." Elise nodded, her exhaustion evident. "I know. It's just, there's so much to do." "There always will be," Naomi said gently. "But you're not alone in this. Let others carry some of the weight." Elise took those words to heart. She began delegating more responsibilities to the coalition she had helped build, trusting her colleagues to continue the work. It was a difficult adjustment, but it allowed her to focus on what mattered most. As spring turned to summer, the city began to see tangible results from its efforts. Crime rates dropped as trust between police and community members improved. Programs like Bridging Voices were replicated in neighboring cities, spreading the message of accountability and collaboration. For Elise and Margaret, the journey was far from over, but they had come to understand that change was not a destination. It was a process. Together, they had built a bridge where once there had been a chasm, proving that even the most fractured relationships could be mended with effort, empathy, and courage. And so the work continued, driven by the belief that a better future was not just possible but inevitable. All that required was the willingness to take the first step, and then the next.